Доброе утро, коллеги.
I'm sorry, we're in English.
Okay, Fabian with us?
Yes, should be here.
Okay. So we start our practice of discussing the European integration from the different angles within the another Zoom online session of the I'm very sorry. So we are here to discuss the European Union as international players, looking from the different angles and from the different theoretical perspectives. We have a group of the excellent speakers, all of them basically from Russia, from our university, but we also have Fabian Bossuyt from the Ghent University. Fabian, hello, good morning. Glad to see you. We start with some of our, Tatiana, hello, how are you doing? How is everything?
Very good, thank you.
Excellent.
So far, so good. Well, as good as it can be in present circumstances, I guess.
Yes, next Monday I'm moving to the Leningrad, St. Petersburg region. I'll stay another 1 month in the woods, but we'll still have a reasonable connection with internet. Okay, the point of today's discussion is to look at Europe as international player from the different national, regional, and theoretical perspectives. I think the timing for this discussion politically is very good as well, because Europe is now facing, as everyone, they're facing the changing international circumstances. So it might be of use to address how the European Union institutional design and machinery are adapting themselves and prepared to adapt themselves for these new international circumstances and contingencies. So I'm very much looking forward for our discussion. I think that it was finally a good idea to hold these seminars under the roof of the HSE April conference. And we have, besides all other meetings and working meetings, working sessions, and discussions of administrative nature, we have more chances to address some academic issues, which is always revealing and which is also very nice, taking into consideration the fact that many of us are overloaded with administrative things as well. At least I do enjoy it very much. And I'm very, very grateful for you all, for coming and for sharing this panel with us. So our first speaker is our master student, and I think very soon our PhD student, Malyutina. So we have very short budget of time. We have about 1 hour, 25 minutes. So I ask all speakers to be very correct and strict with the timing and limit themselves within the interval of 10 minutes as maximum. Okay, Daria, the floor is yours, please. We're anticipating your...
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I didn't expect to be the first today.
You are the first on the list you sent to me. This is here.
Oh, really? Yeah. Is it?
It was your idea.
Okay. I will start then. Okay, let me have my presentation sharing with you. Okay. So before I begin, I need to say that I had to change a bit, correct my topic, and it's not as it was present in the program. I mean, the general idea remained the same. I really want to focus on resilience and its results in practice, but I really had to shift my perspective from pragmatism to the resilience itself, because just I understood that if I focus on on pragmatism, I will go to nothing, because European Union has a very peculiar understanding of pragmatism anyway. So, turn to resilience in EU foreign policy, results and institutional impact on implementation. Before we start, so I want to, sorry, I have to do this like this. Okay, so why study resilience in the first place? The most obvious explanation is that it's a major leitmotif of the 2016 EU global strategy, where resilience was mentioned over 40 times. Besides, the concept itself was meant to bring fundamental changes to the EU foreign policy. And even now, even though it's already been nearly 4 years so far after the introduction of the concept, its attributes remain kind of unclear, and the literature is divided into a group of those who claim that resilience is a brand new concept with the potential to fundamentally reform the EU external actions, and those who believe it to be only buzzword or wishful thinking. Okay, so before I try to tackle this dilemma, I want to also mention that the EU approach to resilience is unique in its nature, and it differs a lot from the general academic approach to resilience, which can be present in basically academic literature and the rhetoric of international organizations like the UN, for example. Due to the time constraints, I will not cover each point one by one. So you can see them on the table, you can see the differences on the table. I will only comment the last one and explain why there is nothing on the left column. So principle of pragmatism, that is a distinctive feature of resilience, of the EU understanding of resilience. This presents a kind of a interdependency between norms and interests, meaning that interests kind of derive from norms. And since the general academic approach do not have very strong normative component and does not need to correlate with norms, so there is nothing in the left column here. Okay, next slide. So yeah, and besides, resilience also differs from the previous foreign policy concept of the European Union, mainly civilian and normative powers, which were reflected in the European Security Strategy, which is in the middle column. And in this table, you can see the comparison between the European Security Strategy of 2003, which reflects mainly normative power concept, and the European Union Global Strategy, which basically introduced resilience to us. Once again, due to time constraints, I will not follow one by one. I will only comment that there are 4 similarities and 4 differences that can be obvious to us, meaning that the distinctive features of resilience shall be more bottom-up approach. So we focus on civil society mostly than on the governments, technical issues, tailor-made instruments instead of standardized or universalized instruments of the normative power. And finally, the special focus on inter-policy cooperation and, even more importantly, inter-department cooperation within the European Union itself. So the idea of my research was, therefore, try to catch these distinctive features in practice. To do so, the methodological model was elaborated, which helped to assess the influence of resilience. Thus, the European Union policy towards the Eastern Partnership countries were studied in order to understand if they became more bottom-up, technocratic, tailor-made, and focused on the inter-department cooperation. Well, this course system is quite complex, and I can comment it if you ask me to, but due to the time constraints, once again, I will not focus on it in detail, but to cut it short, EU policy towards each Eastern Partnership country is awarded with a score for each component, I mean, bottom-up, technocratic, and so on and so forth. And then the scores are summed, and the final numbers are interpreted into the level of resilience. There you can see here on this table on the right. Sorry. The final assessments are as follows. The most striking feature here is not the fact that resilience is barely prominent in the EU external actions, but that the level of resilience influence seems not to depend on the specificity of the country or the state of relations between the EU and the EU and the government of these countries. Thus, for example, while Georgia, which enjoys good and well-established relations with the European Union, has one of the lowest scores for resilience-related changes. Armenia, which is a member of the competing integrational project, experienced the moderate influence of resilience. So these findings kind of lead us to idea that the effect of resilience is the result of EU's internal causes and specificity of policies realization by its institutions. So, to cut it short, what are these institutional features that affect resilience influence? First of all, I believe that it's institutional inertia due to the involvement of many actors. So there are many veto actors who have their own interests and they compete with each other, which results only in half measures. Secondly, only cosmetic changes to the previous past dependence. Past dependence is the most important concept of the historical neo-institutionalism. What I mean by this point, that even though Ukrainian crisis demonstrated the necessity to change, these transformations were mostly in rhetoric because the Union simply could not experience fundamental changes, because that would mean putting aside its normative component. But the European Union cannot put aside its normative component because it's basically norms and values that constitute their source of credibility. So when it comes to the choice between efficiency and normative component, it seems like the European Union would always stick to the normative component. Thirdly, the variety of resilience interpretation prevents institutions and divisions from working with each other. I mean, one of the reasons to use resilience as a new foreign policy concept in the first place was that its vagueness could reach the non-frequently communicating actors within the European Union itself, thus creating the coherency and consistency in EU foreign policy. But in reality, each institution and even each department understands resilience differently. And in the case of joint work, it becomes time-consuming and less efficient, so it discourages actors from cooperation. And the last point, I do not really believe that it requires any special comments on it, because it's quite obvious now that the EU is experiencing a solidarity crisis, which weakens institutions and overload them with internal agenda. What I mean by weakening institutions is that there are less chances to reach compromise on any issue. So, what insights can the analysis of foreign policy and external resilience can bring to internal resilience and the internal policy? First of all, the Union shall not abandon its foreign policy obligations, especially towards the neighboring countries, even due to the rise of internal challenges, since the stability as well as credibility of the Union largely depend on the success of the policies in the nearby region. Or as it was put in the European Union global strategy, my neighbors and my partners' weaknesses are my own weaknesses, and we shall never forget about that. Secondly, and lastly, no success in internal resilience building is possible unless a certain institutional adjustments are done and confidence building measures among the member states are performed. So, as it was proven in terms of foreign policy implementation, the major causes for the policy's inertia and inability to quickly adapt are the institutional overcomplexity and solidarity crisis within the EU. So it brings us to the conclusion that the EU shall change itself first in order to provoke changes elsewhere. That's all for now. I believe I made a very short and brief introduction to my research, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting approach and very interesting from your perspective, the angle looking at the topic of the resilience, which seems to be a little bit passing away from the European agenda, but anyway remains an important international tool. Well, I personally believe that this topic and these theoretical concepts deserves even more attention. Maybe we will see it on the particular institutional examples, like College of Europe in Bruges will become more resilient because of the new leadership, but who knows? So, you at the end of your presentation, you stated a very bold political statement regarding the interconnection between the European Union internal developmental dynamics and its external action. But can it have certain historical references? For example, if we look at the foreign policy, the external actions of the European communities in the very beginning of the integration. As I do remember, there was no significant time gap between the Rome Treaty and the beginning of more active connection, active relationships with the external partners, between the community of six and external partners. So do you think that it has any time been an example in the European history when the internal changes and then the external action became more efficient because of them?
Well, it just, sorry, it's echoed here somewhere. Well, I cannot really think of it right now, to be honest. Well, probably my colleagues will help me on that because I'm just a bit at a loss at the question right now. I cannot say that it comes to me right now.
Okay. So are there any other questions from our participants? Please just switch on your microphone if you want.
Okay. Professor Romanova raised her hand. Thank you so much
Tatiana,
for that.
No, it's not actually about resilience. It's more about recommendations that you made. And I think the Russians are very good in recommending what the European Union has to do. But what does Russia have to do? And what do our partners of the European Union have to do in respect of your presentation, in respect of resilience?
Well, I approach this particular topic from the perspective of the European Union. So I actually wanted to maximize the use of EU's potential, not the other parties. Probably, of course, the external parties have to understand what they actually want from the European Union. Whether they want some closer relations, they need to follow the rules of the European Union. If they kind of sure that they have abilities to do without the European Union, so probably they have to do what their interests recommend them to do.
Okay. Okay, the question is taken, the answer will be considered, and I hope will be used by the author for your further work. Though this sort of questions is already, the answer to this sort of questions depends on the theoretical perspective and the worldview of the author. Well, my answer, for example, would be that Russia should increase its competitive capabilities and take advantage of the current position of the European Union, because Russia is not a member state. But we have we need to go further, and I wanted to ask our friend Alexei Kuznetsov, the director of INION and deputy director of famous IMMO, the most famous international Russian think tank. So Alexei, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My presentation will be very short in terms of PowerPoint, but I hope I started. Nevertheless, well, is it okay or not? Is it okay or not? I see myself, yes. Okay, let's start. In any case, The topic of my report is support of the European Union for the development of social sciences. And I want to tell you some facts only about the case of studies on relations between Russia and the European Union. It is very popular to say that scholars can be a provider of second track in Russian-European Union relations. But when we look in detail at this situation, we can see that it is only words, and we don't have any mechanism to develop this system of second track. First of all, I dare say that we don't have any optimistic prospects in this field. Despite my personal experience, I dare say that in the European Union there is no any significant measures to develop real cooperation between Russian and European Union scientists. Of course, we have Horizon 2020, and Russian scholars can participate in these programs with their foreign partners. In fact, I also participate when I was in IMAMO in one program about Arctic, and we realized small project about EU-Russian cooperation in Arctic region, in oil and gas sector, and so on. And before in framework program 7, also there was an example for me too to participate in a joint program, and I spent 1 month in Belgium, but it was like rare examples which prove the negative result of the whole rule. And I see 2 main reasons for this situation. First one is marginal role of social sciences and humanities, mainly in our country, because all joint programs are typically established by representatives of physical science, or chemistry, of earth sciences, but never of social sciences. I remember one of the first scientific conferences about ERANET rules. It was established a decade ago, and one of the first conferences was held in Yekaterinburg. There were about 300 participants, and the main idea was to make incentives like contacts, possible contacts with new partners. But unfortunately, among 300 participants, there were 5 Russian representatives of social sciences and only 1 representative of social sciences from the European Union. So it was a comic situation. It was impossible to find any partner during that conference. The second reason is a marginal role of Russia in the European Union research agenda. We can see that Sovietologists' studies decreases. It is understandable thing, but we also can see that only few new specialists try to investigate Russia in detail. So it is really very difficult to find partners in European countries. Of course, we can find them, and Tatiana Romanova can prove my words. It was her idea to establish a large project to make joint articles about European Union-Russian relations in different fields. And I found a Hungarian partner. We made an article in Q1 of Scopus, it was Journal of Contemporary European Studies. But afterwards we met in Moscow, to discuss our further cooperation, and I found that we don't have any fields to develop our first successful attempt, because the only topic which was interested for Hungarians in my field was energy dialogue, and during several years this energy dialogue is not comfortable for grant proposals even in Hungary. Also, we shouldn't forget about Russian position in this dialogue. Several years ago, IMMO won a participant in Horizon 2020 program. I told you about this Arctic program, but in fact, we didn't receive any budget. Several years ago, it was a decision of the Russian Federation to finance Russian partners from the Russian budget. But when you win a project within Horizon 2020, you should go to the Russian ministry and make a second competition. And only one project from 3 receive money. 2 others can survive as they like. In fact, we study Yamal in Germany because our German partners had a budget for conferences, and when we need money, we received it in Germany. But it is very funny to study Yamal in Germany. Once we also visit Italy, and once it was a project in, within the project was conference in Portugal. So very productive to study Arctic resources in Portugal and Germany. But it was a decision of the Russian Ministry of Education several years ago to support only one participant from 3, and this one participant was, of course, a representative of natural sciences. It is also very difficult to find partners in the European Union because many programs in the European Union don't have special lines for cooperation with the Russian Federation. On the contrary, European experts are afraid of Russian topic because they understand that it is more comfortable to declare something neutral, and if they want to study Russia, they can study Russian agenda within these neutral topics like post-Soviet area or like post-socialist transformation, but not Russia. And as a result, they don't need any official Russian partner. They can cooperate without problems, but without money with you, but not in joint projects. Some people had great hopes connecting with the Russian Science Foundation and Russian Fund for Basic Research because they typically have national programs, joint programs with the National Science Foundation from the European Union countries. In fact, we have only several real programs. For example, Russian Science Foundation declared only programs with Belgium, or exactly with Flandria, with Austria, with France, and with Germany. This year, 0 projects from social science and humanities were supported by all of these 4 programs. Moreover, in France, they stopped cooperation in social science. A year ago, there was a successful story. 3 social projects were supported by Russian Science Foundation in cooperation with DFG. The total number was 25, which is a good for humanities. But all these 3 projects were not connected with modern political or economic sciences. The first one was origin of Eastern Neanderthals, is archaeology in Altai. The second was on land and sea, medical geography in the Russian Empire. And the third one, Russian republicanism from the Middle Ages to late 20th century. And what is more interesting, all German partners were from two universities of Bavaria, from Munich and from Erlangen-Nuremberg. And I understand the reason, because in those years, Bavarian government supported many conferences to establish cooperation between Russians and Germans. And the same situation is in RFBR. Only Hungary, due to its fund for Russian language and culture, supports 10 projects in cooperation with Russian fund for basically 10 projects a year. It is all of them connected with Hungary, but in fact they represent many fields like philosophy, modern economy, political sciences, and of course literature and language studies, education. When we look at German partners, French partners, 2-3 projects a year. For example, 2019, French projects from Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. 3 projects, one from archaeology, Neanderthals, the second from economic history, Western Siberia in 19th century, college and something like this. And only one project was supported in the field of social science, which are a little bit connected with Russian cooperation. It is a place of Russian Orthodox Church in France and Russia. So, in conclusion, I want to say that in fact, we have main drivers only in the field of personal contacts and historical ties. So if a scientist had some friends, some partners from previous times in the European Union, probably they can establish some cooperation. The second option is connected with such countries like Hungary from the Soviet period. But in fact, we don't have a real system of support for mutual research contracts in the field of social sciences, both from the European Union side and from the Russian Federation side. So it is a very pessimistic thing, because all these ideas about second track is illusion or propaganda, but nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexei. I think that your observations and the conclusions are very important contribution to the continuation of the debate on the institutional integrated in institutional entities and restraints of the European Union connection and cooperation with their external partners, which are not part of the same institutional structure or not considered to be in a preparation to join the institutional structure. Do we have any questions from the colleagues in the room, in the Zoom?
Yes, Tatiana Romanova raised her hand.
Tatiana, please.
I'm sorry to be the only one who asks questions, but I have. I absolutely share the concerns of Alexei. Yeah, as somebody who researches on this topic and who participates in different competitions, and moreover, I can probably amend his conclusion by saying that personal contacts can help you to draft the proposal, but they absolutely do not guarantee that you win this proposal. Yeah, so these are sort of like two themes, yeah, that we have to keep in mind. But I do have like 2 questions, one microeconomic and one macroeconomic, yeah, if I want to classify them. Well, the microeconomic question is more about the discipline of social science, because I grade projects now work quite a lot with different assessments. And I find that frequently in natural sciences, people support each other strongly, yeah? And they sort of like say, if it's excellent, it's excellent, yeah? Whereas in social sciences, I frequently find that like the following assessment, it's an excellent project, and then the actual grade is 4, yeah? So you have to decide if it's an excellent project and then you give 5, or it's just like if you give 4, you have to justify that. In other words, like the corporate spirit in social sciences, in my view, is different from the corporate spirit in natural sciences, which overall means that finally we lose out when we grade each other. You know? So that's a microeconomic question about the discipline. And then the macroeconomic question is more about, you talked a lot about Horizon 2020, but Horizon 2020 is nearly over, as well as the FP7. So what are the prospects? Any news in terms of how much money will be given? What will be the priorities? I mean, yeah, so have you explored that? I understand that that's sort of like, it's a difficult area, it's very difficult to speculate, but we already heard that due to the shortage of finance, there are plans to reduce money allocated to academic research and cooperation. So maybe you know more and maybe you can elaborate on that point.
Okay, and first question. I can agree with you, but not in all aspects. It is really a problem that, at least in Russia, at least in Russian Fund for Basic Research, in many programs we have competition, undecent competition between natural sciences and social sciences. I remember not the case of international projects, because I participate as an expert only in young scientists programs. The best example is my first grant. In theory, you never can receive more than 22 scores by 24 in total, because 2 is connected with your experience like a leader, team leader. And strangely, I found that humanities was defeated by specialists in physics, because everybody from physics received 23 or 24. Because all specialists in physics understand that it is impossible in the competition, my first grant, to receive these 2 scores, and they make a present for everybody because they thought that this system is stupid. And if you received less than 21, it was impossible to receive a grant, even if you are the first number in your field, because it was like a theoretical preposition. So if you are a representative for social sciences, you should be the best one in the country, then you can receive. If you are a specialist from physics or chemical, you can be a middle level research and you will be okay. It is really a problem, but there is also another problem. Different views on research agenda in the European Union and Russia. Within the joint competition between Russian and German participants, it was 3 years ago when Russian Science Foundation decided to make the project with DevGap in Germany. We had many proposals from social sciences, including High School of Economics, and they received good marks in Russia. But all these marks were very low in German expertise process. And vice versa, German projects received excellent marks in Germany, and these topics were not very interesting in Russia. Then there was a small scandal, and we, Russian part, made a victory. Our German colleagues from the DFG told that they agree that their topics, which looked like excellent in Germany, were not excellent. And they changed marks from A to C. When we asked them what's about Russia, they told no, they're also very bad. And that is why the last DFG, which announced several months ago, has 0 victories from social sciences. So it is not only the problem of specialists in social sciences and their attitude to colleagues, but it is also a problem of different criteria for topics of research in Russia and European Union, and is a real problem. As for macroeconomic, of course it is a problem, but I'm not sure that it is a problem of social sciences, because in general we have so few shares in total budgets that even nowadays it is a very difficult situation. For example, the last call for Euronet Roots Plus, which ended on Friday. Only 2 topics for social sciences: demography, migrations, conflicts, and security issues, and opportunities for and challenges to regional development and social cohesion. And I think it is a rather good situation, because in previous years topics were more narrow. So the second problem is real, but not very difficult exactly for social science.
Can I just cite one more example, because I think it's appropriate here?
Yes, please.
And that's about Jean Monnet funding from last year. And I think it's curious, yeah, because there is also another thing which in fact affects the Russians. There were so many proposals for Jean Monnet funding last year from the Russians, that the sort of like the threshold for the Russians was much higher than the threshold, the overall threshold for other nationalities. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
actually, as a Russian, to be funded, you had to be super good last year, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Which in fact sent a wrong message, sort of like it sent a message that basically there is some sort of a discrimination of the Russians. Yeah, but the agency, the education agency of the European Union says that, in fact, that resulted from the fact that the Russians were so good and so many in applications. Yeah, and therefore, if they didn't increase the threshold for the Russians, then it would be only Russians who got the Jean Monnet money. Yeah. So there is this side as well, which is about competition, which is good, like on the one hand, yeah, because we are so good, but then it also means that it's tougher for the Russians compared to other nationalities.
Wow, it was not absolutely academic comment, and it is not easy to respond it in the academic terms. Well, I would personally advocate this sort of approach, especially given the fact that some of our friends whom we know well for many, many years, especially I do, received this Jean Monnet chair without any basic prerequisites or substantial contributions. So the choices have been made also with a high level of the institutional and institutional connectivity dependence. So maybe it's a good time to slow down a little bit in a way, and then look at their selection procedure and process in order to avoid such cases as we both know, for example, very well. Okay, so if we do we have any other questions? I beg your pardon me.
No one raised their hands.
Excellent. I don't. Well, I mean, you can raise your hand. You can also send it to the chat, which I can see. So our next speaker is Artem Alikin, our former student and nowadays our junior colleague teaching in our faculty and doing some research. Artem, please, the floor is yours. Daria.
Yeah.
Where is Artem?
Well, he's here. I believe he's opening his presentation. At least he has his mic.
Yes.
Are you ready to present? Or
I think it's frozen. Maybe we can move.
yeah,
Okay.
probably.
Okay, Tatiana, if you suggest that we can move, can I ask you to jump in and tell us something?
Oh, Artyom, are you ready?
Yes. I'm ready. Sorry, it was some problem with internet connection.
Okay, go ahead. Do you have a presentation?
Yes.
Yes, please. Load it, and we anticipate. We are wasting our time. Please be fast.
Okay. Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Thank you. So, hello, dear colleagues. I'm Alikin, and the theme of my presentation is the impact of the concept of resilience on the EU democracy and human rights promotion policy, Eastern Partnership countries case. So actually, you see, first of all, some words about the content of my presentation. Firstly, I will explain briefly why my theme is relevant. Then I will show the question, the main aim of my research, my presentation, and after that I'll show actually why actually the Eastern Partnership countries is an appropriate case for evaluating EU democracy and human rights promotion policy within the focus of the resilience concept, and then I show some limitations for EU democratization abroad policy within the framework of the resilience concept. Then I'll tell more about conceptual and ideational limitations, and finally I'll tell you about my main findings. Speaking about the relevance, in 2014, you know, the European Union adopted new EU global strategy, and this document presented the new ambitious concept, the resilience, actually the resilience concept. In 2017-2018, European External Action Services stated the strategic character of this concept. Then some researchers, for example, Natalie Tocci, actually one of authors of European Union Global Strategy, said that one of aims of this concept, and I mean, of course, the resilience concept, is to balance the normative approach of the EU or universalist idealism in EU foreign policy identity. And finally, nowadays, we have some EU reports on European Union global strategy implementation, and actually some academic assessments of this implementation. Actually, these reports and these academic evaluations allows me to put the question, actually, why the EU failed to adjust its approach to democratization abroad as a part of the strategic approach of the resilience. And to answer these questions, I put the aim to identify possible limitations for the implementation of the EU democratization abroad policies within the framework of the concept of resilience. Actually, why the Eastern Partnership is appropriate case for such research. So firstly, from the point of view of European foreign policy, Eastern Partnership countries is the EU border. Eastern Partnership is the recent important political project of European Union, and moreover, this political project can be characterized as the high institutionalized project. Then, secondly, from the point of view of European studies, the Eastern Partnership countries is obvious popular case of application of European normative approach of the normative power of Europe and so on. I believe it's logic to evaluate the transformation of European normative approach also on the example of the Eastern Partnership countries. And finally, thirdly, from the point of view of democratization studies, nowadays the Eastern Partnership countries are in fact the specific zone of contact of two trends. I mean, from the one side, the democratization trends, and from the other side, the obvious authorization, autocracy promotion trends. These three reasons make the Eastern Partnership countries quite good, quite appropriate case for such research. So, speaking about limitations for European Union democracy promotion policy within the framework of resilience concept, according to EU documents and also the current academic discourse, these limitations can be divided into three groups. First of them is the so-called external limitations. This group of limitations include so-called continuing global liberal interventionism. It implies, first of all, the US approach to democratization abroad. The problem is that the US approach is intended to cooperation with government, some governmental actors, agents, and so on, rather than a cooperation with local communities, civil societies, and other small societal actors. And the third important external limitations is the perceiving post-Soviet, actually quite anti-democratic post-Soviet inertia within East Partnership countries' societies. The second group of limitations, it's so-called internal limitations. In fact, all elements, all phenomena of these limitations are closely correlated with so-called polycrisis. There are populist wave, the growth of Euroscepticism, EU democratic deficit, and so on and so on. Polycrisis is actually the academic perception of the existential crisis which was said by the former president of the EU Commission, Juncker. And the third group, conceptual and additional limitations. And I want to tell more about this group to clarify what I mean. The main feature of this limitation is actually inconsistency. For example, on the material of EU documents, we see the trend for desecuritization of the region of countries of Eastern Partnership, despite of let's say Ukrainian problem, Ukrainian crisis, some frozen conflict in the region, and so on. And amid these desecuritization trends, we see the actually academic researchers, for example, Thomas Lisse, stated about securitization trend, and the EU is intended to securitize the democracy promotion itself, because democratic reform and so on implies a kind of instability and so on, and this potential instability is quite incompatible with resilience, stability, and so on. Secondly, we can say about inconsistency between politicization and depoliticization. What I mean, the EU say about the problematic of democratic representation, human rights, and so on in quite politicized way. But simultaneously, the EU makes attempt to present its measures to promote democracy in as a depoliticized, quite technocratic instrument. That's actually quite impossible. Then we have so-called opposition technocracy we see in presentation. So what I mean, technocratic approach to democracy means that good working democracy provides more information about your border, about your neighbors. It provides actually stability and resilience, and at the same time, good working democracy provides representation for groups and interests which in fact cannot be incompatible with the European norm, with the ground of European norm. Ukrainian case can be also the example of such situation. And finally, the direction of democratization, they are classically top-down and bottom-up democratization. As, for example, Daria said, the resilience concept implies bottom-up democratization. But surprisingly, there are still states and actually governments in Eastern Partnership countries, and the EU should cooperate, should contact with governments, and in fact, the EU has to operate, has to fulfill its democratization policy within the approach top-down, and it's the problem of combination of two approach and some main findings I suggest. First of all, we see the inconsistency in attempts to implement the resilience concept. Secondly, we see the excessive complexity and the excessive abstractness of new strategic approach. I mean the resilience concept. And then if we try to interpret so-called external and internal limitations, we can see that external limitations actually the norm of modern international relations, just because the existence of states and their foreign policy is a normal phenomena for modern international relations. And internal limitations are in fact the recent context of the EU integration project, just because all these phenomena like populist wave, Euroscepticism, and so on, had existed before the European Union global strategy, before the resilience concept, and so on and so on. And in fact, the conceptual and additional limitations are the main limitations for implementing this concept. I mean, the resilience concept, and maybe namely this resilience concept has as a result the fact that actually external and internal challenges for the modern EU became actually more than challenges. They became namely limitations for European Union policies. Actually, that's my evaluation of the resilience concept on EU democratic and human rights promotion policies on the example of Eastern Partnership countries. So, thank you for your attention, dear colleagues.
Splendid, very much. Do we have any questions from the Zoom? Well, if not yet, I would suggest that.
I'm sorry. We do have a question. We do have a question from.
Yes, Tatiana, please.
No, not Tatiana this time. Alina Arnautova. Could you please switch on your mic and
Tatiana Romanova.
Ah.
If you look, yes, please. So Alina, and then we ask Tatiana, and Fabian.
Thank you very much, Artem Anatolyevich, for your presentation. It was very interesting. And my question is, what about the normative dimension of the conception of resilience? What do you think about this dimension for the policies for European Eastern Partnership? Thank you.
Can I answer that? Yes. So, as I have said, as far as I understand, the concept of resilience doesn't, let's say, decline the normative dimension of European foreign policy. It should have it should have corrected actually this normative approach with accordance of I would say changing international arena accordance with the changed let's say challenges to the existence of European Union and actually the document, I mean the new strategy said about this. So just that's my answer maybe.
Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Fabienne, please.
Yeah, okay. I think there's a clear pattern to be discerned in this panel, namely that there's a lot of interest in the concept of resilience, because also my paper focuses on this. But when it comes to the paper by Artem, I guess we can see also quite a lot of similarities in terms of the findings with the paper by Daria. So in a way, I think, yeah, both your papers sort of confirm each other. But what I'm interested in, especially then also in view of my own paper, and the argument I'm going to make in my paper concerns these ideational limitations that you're pointing to as being one of the main limitations of the EU's approach to resilience. So could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what you mean with these ideational limitations? Because that's not yet entirely clear to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. I mean, I try to say about limitations for implementation of European foreign policy within the framework of resilience on the example of EU democracy and human rights promotion policy actually. And as far as I understand, these limitations can be linked with, let's say, a source of these limitations, and we can find first group of these limitations in some external for the European Union actors, factors, and so on. And I will try and I I said about the US foreign policy, about so-called promotion of autocracy in Russia and China foreign policy, and so on. The second source for such a limitation is some internal for the EU phenomena, and as I took it from the academic discourse, there are actually some phenomena which can be embraced by the term, by the concept of polycrisis. Thus, these phenomena are the populist wave, the growth of Euroscepticism, actually in any degree the Brexit, actually the EU democratic deficit, and so on and so on. And finally, yes, conceptual and additional limitations, and by these limitations I mean some peculiarities of structure of this concept of actually the academic and actually formal EU discourse, which explain this concept of resilience. So actually, three sources: external sources, internal sources, and let's say theoretical or discursive sources of limitations. Yes, and I believe main finding is that the third group of limitations are the main, more serious limitations. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Fabienne. Okay, Tatiana Romanova.
Yeah, so this is more theoretical question. David Chandler, who I call the patriarch of resilience, although he doesn't like this title himself, so you shouldn't be repeating me on that. But he recently proclaimed the death of resilience because of current circumstances. And one of the reasons is that because the threat is actually inside us, so the danger, the threat that we currently fight is inside us in the form of the disease and not external to us any longer. And that follows on Agamben and on that trend. How would you, I mean, I know that you talk about the EU's concept of resilience and not about the academic concept of resilience. But do you think that argument of David Chandler will affect your sort of like critique of resilience in the way it is applied in European Union?
First of all, I think it's a kind of let's say academic fashion to say about the death of something like this, maybe since 1960s. So maybe Chandler followed this fashion.
Well, we have to understand that he's a provocateur. That's his academic. So in that sense, we have to take it with a grain of salt. But anyways,
I think actually any discussion about the death of something should provoke not the, let's say, the reject of from this conception. Any discussion about the death should provoke actually some discussion to develop the concept, maybe to revitalize actually it. So I think Chandler's arguments absolutely can take place. We should take them into consideration, but I think it isn't the reason just to forgive their resilience, actually. So that's my opinion.
Well, I'm personally not absolutely convinced that we should discuss a certain generally suicidal attitudes towards the methodological concepts invented by the certain person. And if a certain person shows a suicidal attitude towards his own inventions, that is not our problem. Well, I think that Tatiana's question brings us to another topic, which for me seems underexplored, but maybe it's just a problem of my lack of reading. How this concrete invented relatively recently concept has been incorporated into the general mainstream theories and considered within the general categories of the major mainstream theories of international relations and European integration. So if some of our colleagues look at this concept from this angle, from this particular angle, then we will find a certain value, or not will find a certain value of this particular concept, regardless of the decisions of somebody who said the word being the first. Okay, so the next speaker is Vasily Kashin, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Yes, Vasily.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I do not use PowerPoint, so I will do without it. Okay, so I thank you for this opportunity to discuss EU security role in Asia. European Union is affecting the security situation in Indo-Pacific region in two major ways. The first is the traditional role of Europe as one of the key providers of modern defense and dual-use technology to most of the regional countries. This role is undergoing certain change. Historically, Europe was a major arms exporter to all of the major regional players, including China. The massive defense technology transfer to China continued until the decision of European Council of Ministers in July 1989 on imposing the arms embargo on People's Republic of China in retaliation for Tiananmen Square incident. However, this role has never stopped. After the imposition of embargo, each of the European countries has adopted its own national list of prohibited items, usually intentionally leaving significant loopholes in this in these national lists, sometimes limiting them only to lethal weapons or finished military platforms, which made it possible to maintain cooperation in a number of defense-related and gray zones. In fact, for most of the post-embargo period, European arms exports to China amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars each year, and the key defense technology providers were basically the same: France, Germany, Italy, and Great Britain. However, the most important factor which defined European behavior in this area was not the embargo, but rather political considerations of individual European countries and growing European coordination in arms exports. So the attempts of People's Republic to dramatically boost the European arms export to China, to remove the obstacles and as maximum goal to lobby for the lifting of the embargo, continued for 90s and early 2000s, but ultimately failed. The complete failure of the Chinese lobbying campaign on embargo lifting was associated with Angela Merkel becoming German chancellor. She basically was the person which killed this project completely, in spite of objections from France and Italy and UK at that time. Still, this cooperation continued at a limited scale, but now the European role in defense technology transfers is changing because of the growing pressure from the American side on the Europeans to improve their export controls and limit any kind of transfers of defense technology to China. At the same time, there are new interesting patterns in European behavior in arms transfers to other regional players. For example, in early 1990s, China managed to pressure the Europeans to completely stop any kind of arms transfers to Taiwan. The last major deals were the sale of Chinese frigates, Lafayette, in 1992, and about the same time, the sale of Chinese fighter jets. As other deals were basically aborted, including the Dutch attempt to sell conventional submarine to the Taiwanese. Now we see the re-emergence of the Taiwan arms sales issues, and recently there was a rather angry exchange between the French and the Chinese defense ministries, foreign ministries, on exactly the Chinese attempt to get a contract on improving the previously sold combat ships to Taiwan. If such change in European approach to arms transfer to Taiwan happens, that will be a very significant factor affecting the relationship, because People's Republic of China would surely retaliate. In other Asian countries, the European maintained high level of activity in India, but sometimes faced significant setbacks in other Asian countries, specifically Southeast Asian ones, because of the political reasons, European coordination, objections in some European countries over supposed human rights violations in Southeast Asia. So Europeans remain remain a significant factor in Southeast Asian countries, but have been gradually losing ground. That may change to a certain extent because of the deepening Chinese-American rivalry, because in this situation, many smaller Southeast Asian nations, being afraid to be drawn into this battle, are choosing arms suppliers among the players which are not really present in the region in a major way, which includes Israel, Russia, and European Union. Especially informative is the case of Vietnam, which resumed large-scale procurement in Russia, boosted cooperation with Israel, and is trying gradually to improve defense technology relations with the European Union. The real close defense industrial partnership is only existing between European Union and India, where Europeans are conducting, especially the French, are conducting major tech transfers. Still, they are lagging behind United States and Russia in presence on this market because of high prices, gradual loss of competitiveness, and rigid policies. So the major focus of political battle now is Americans forcing Europeans to increase their export controls and limit ties with the People's Republic in the area of dual-use technologies, such as materials, such as space, communications, electronics, because in these areas, the cooperation between the Chinese and the Europeans remains very significant, and considerable amount of technological information is flowing to China. For example, the first the first quantum communication satellite in the world, which was launched by the Chinese in 2015, was basically the result of their cooperation with with an Austrian university. Now the Europeans will have to decide if this cooperation continues or stops, and that is creating significant conflict. Second is traditional European security role in Asia Pacific. European Union started to express growing interest towards participating in resolution of the Asian Pacific and Indo-Pacific security issues since 2000. Initially, it was just an attempt to make European Union more visible, especially in areas such as combating terrorism, piracy, various illicit activities, strengthening local security forces, without actually taking any sides. However, as long as China-US relations have been worsening, Europeans started to play more active and more like pronounced role in regional security. The effort was generally led by UK and France, which have traditional security presence in the region, the only European countries with traditional security presence in the region. The United Kingdom started to invigorate the military alliance they have in the region, the defense arrangement that they started to hold new exercises, hosted some with the local military, increased number of visits. The French, to a certain extent, boosted their military presence on their Pacific, remaining by regional standards, quite leaderships. Yeah.
We do not hear you. Probably you should switch off your camera so that it could increase the speed of your internet.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, I think I just... So the French still maintain this presence. They are trying to boost it to a certain extent. And since 2016, when there was UNCLOS ruling on China-Philippines dispute on South China Sea, European countries boosted their participation in this issue, supporting the claims of the Southeast Asian nations, calling on China to abide to the international law, and they started to send actual combat ships into the area. However, the defense capabilities of the European Union are, which could be deployed in this area, are largely symbolic, cannot affect the regional balance of power in any major way. However, the emergence of the Europeans, their visits, the visits of their combat ships to the local ports, symbolized more active position of the Union on the regional security issues, and the process of gradual European siding with the United States and Japan on a number of security issues. United Kingdom tried to separately boost their defense cooperation with Japan in forms of information exchange and joint exercises, causing significant Chinese annoyance. So the general trend was set that Europeans started to gradually improve their support of the US policies on Pacific, and in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, which was published by Pentagon in last year, Europeans are considered to be important partners. Some other European countries which were not present traditionally in the region also tried to boost their presence, like Germans at least discussed sending a frigate into the area, and I think sent it at some point. And they started to hold a growing number of consultations. However, that significantly annoyed the Chinese, which decided to show the Europeans that actually it is a two-way street. And we saw the first deployment of Chinese Navy in joint exercise with the Russians on Baltic Sea in 2017. The Europeans are now starting to understand that they are being affected by what's happening on Pacific in a more major way. The key obstacle to boosting European role in Asian Pacific security is first the fact that United Kingdom, which was the most experienced player and the player which actually possessed the most significant expeditionary capabilities, has left, and now would be operating independently. Second major issue is lack of unity, because Chinese are participating in the regional politics in probably more active way than the Europeans participating in Asian politics. There is 16+1 mechanism. There is successful Chinese engagement with the Italians, and the Italians supported the Belt and Road Initiative, quite possibly not fully understanding what it is about. And with worsening economic situation and growing Chinese role in global economy, it's now hard to predict what will prevail. This growing anti-Chinese sentiment because of the pandemics or the growing Chinese economic role. China on its own will also increasingly project power into Atlantic, will be more and more present in the regions which are important, which could be considered as zones of traditional influence by Europeans, like Africa, which would make the relationship probably even more tense. So currently, Europe, since 2018, since Federica Mogherini's tour in Asian countries discussing regional securities, Europeans are making more and more of statements how they want to participate in this. Mostly it could be, it could just result in supporting certain initiatives from Washington, ASEAN countries, or Japan, and withholding some additional technology from China. In general, of course, the tools are quite limited. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vasily. Timofey handed the reins of the chair to me, like for a short while. So I suggest that we take questions now, if there are any. Any questions? Question?
No one raised their hands yet.
But maybe somebody will express their intention. No? Okay, I suggest then that we move over, and then we can come back to you if there are any questions afterwards. Any question afterwards? Okay, Yulia, I think it's your time now. Yeah, so that's at least according to the list that I was handed to.
Okay.
So please, the floor is yours, and if you have a presentation, then do put it on.
Yes, thank you very much. It's my pleasure and privilege to speak to you today. As a research assistant of Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies and PhD student of National Research University High School of Economics. So today I'm going to present a very sensitive, I think, topic on the role of the European Union's main institutions, the Court of Justice of the European Union, in the development of a common foreign and security policy after the Treaty of Lisbon. Next slide, please. Following the entry into force of the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009, the structure of the European Union has undergone a number of changes. In particular, the European Union foreign policy mechanism was formulated more explicitly, and the division between the European Community and the European Union was abolished. However, the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice in the area of common foreign and security policy remains extremely limited and exceptional. Next slide. Actually, it's worth highlighting the Court of Justice can certainly not supernationalize common foreign and security policy as it did with the market integration to a certain extent, but it can, in the realm of rulings as provided by Article 24 of Treaty of the European Union, rule in a way which would almost certainly have an impact on how common foreign and security policy is implemented. In its turn, Article 24 refers to those articles that are about the demarcation between foreign policy and other European Union policies in which the Court of Justice actually has competences. And those articles that is about sanctions or, speaking in EU language, restrictive measures. Next slide. So this analysis of case law remains in the realm of law, which justifies staying with the concept of integration through law. Today we will focus on three main case law which illustrate very well the place of the court in the common foreign and security policy. The first case includes situations when the Court of Justice interprets its jurisdiction broadly. Thus, in Rosneft case, the Court of Justice interpreted its powers broadly to include the competence to rule on the preliminary references concerning the validity of restrictive measures adopted by the European Union. The Court of Justice argued that, as a general rule, it has a full jurisdiction to review the legality of the acts of the European Union institutions intended to produce legal effects vis-à-vis third parties. Thus, according to the Court of Justice, the limitations set in Article 24, that Court of Justice should not have jurisdiction to review acts adopted in common foreign and security policy, actually represents an exception to this general rule and accordingly should be interpreted restrictively. Next slide. So, the second group of cases involving the Court of Justice in the development of a common foreign and security policy includes situations when it seeks to maximize the external sovereignty of the European Union. CADI cases demonstrate that the Court of Justice can pose an obstacle to implementing the United Nations Security Council sanction resolutions by the European Union if they violate the general principles of European Union law, including human rights, as guaranteed by European Convention on Human Rights. In its judgment, the Court of Justice declines the premise of the Court of First Instance, which the challenge regulations enjoyed immunity from judicial review, as they were adopted in order to implement international obligations, which left no margin of discretion for European Union institutions. This decision was highly criticized by the international expert community. Next slide. In the third group of cases, particularly in Opinion 213, it's a court decision concerning the accession of the European Union to the European Convention on Human Rights. The Court of Justice concluded that there was an incompatibility between the draft agreement on the European Union's accession to the European Convention and the founding treaties. The important issue raised by the court related to common foreign and security policy as an accession to the European Convention on Human Rights would render the European Union's external actions subject to the control of the external institutions or the European Court of Human Rights, including issues that could not be reviewed by the Court of Justice due to its limited jurisdiction. As a result, two options were suggested by the court as a precondition for the European Union's successful accession to European Convention. The first one was to exclude common foreign and security policy from control of the European Court of Human Rights. This condition, of course, was unacceptable for the Council of Europe. The second condition was providing Court of Justice competence in common foreign and security policy. That is obviously unacceptable for member states of European Union. While the Court of Justice adopts, in opinion 213, an approach of blackmailing as one of the appropriate conditions of accession to European Convention, it has put forward an extension of its own competence in the field. Please, next slide. So, in the light of integration through law, the discussion on the role of the Court of Justice in the development of a common foreign and security policy is reduced to the issue of combating contradictions that arise. For example, the discussion on the integration delimitation issue, which refers directly to the consequences of the delimitation of three pillars. The vision of the European Union foreign policy has always been ambiguous, I think so. This follows from the fact that member states continue to perceive common foreign and security policy as a policy area that has not developed beyond the intergovernmental European political cooperation. The changing attitudes to the common foreign and security policy development are still difficult, but should be discussed, I suggest. On the one hand, institutional adaptations can lead to the normalization of common foreign and security policy. This notion can be understood as the consolidation of European Union foreign policy and constitutionalization as a part of the Union's legal order by studying treaty modifications and institutional adaptations. On the other hand, there is a demand from a world community for a clear foreign policy position of the European Union. The nature of such a demand can be found in the desire to justify the external potential of European Union internal development. The ability of the European Union to become a strong global actor depends largely on its ability to cope with internal difficulties and overcome disintegration trends. It's an idea that was mentioned in the previous presentations. The interdependence of both perspectives means that first, common foreign and security policy can become more supranational, and secondly, the European Union can act more coherently on a world stage. And the next slide, please. We conclude that common foreign and security policy is embedded in the European Union's legal order firmly. The scope of a common foreign and security policy intersects with other European Union's policy area. This results in a complex interaction and the participation of the Court of Justice in litigation on common foreign and security policy issues. The Court of Justice cannot disregard the common values and principles of the European Union, which in fact confirms the basic logic of judicialization of politics and the concept of integration through law. So thank you for your attention. Next slide, please. And if you have any questions, it's a pleasure to answer it and to continue further discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia, for the presentation, which brings in a very important and under-researched perspective, at least definitely under-researched in Russia, institutional perspective on the European Court of Justice. And I encourage everybody or whoever like to ask questions.
Yes,
Questions on
we do have one hand raised. This is Alina Arnautova.
And now to see Fabian, who has a question. Fabian?
Okay.
So let's take your question first.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I happen to be also familiar with some of the work of your colleague Kirill Entin, because he has contributed a book chapter to the book that I'm editing with my colleague Peter van Elsewege, and he touches upon very similar issues as issues that you're covering in your paper. But something that perhaps I missed during the presentation is also the conclusion that Kirill came to, that the courts still to be subject to strong influence that member states have on foreign policy. So I was wondering whether you could perhaps share your view on that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. And we also talked with Kirill Antin about this issue, and actually when we talk about the Court of Justice and national, some national perspective, we should take into account the role of national courts that interact with the Court of Justice, and actually we can see that that actually Court of Justice adopts an integrationist approach with the scope of its jurisdictions, and also should listen to the national governments. But we can see in Opinion 213, for instance, that all member states support the accession of the European Union to the European Convention of Human Rights. But court, it was the only player that cannot support this this decision, and and actually the word of the court was decisive, and in this case. So it illustrates actually that not that the member states can say its words, and the court should listen to them. But in the practice, in the case law, we see the opposite situation when courts use some legal conclusions in order to make its decisions more important. And I think it illustrates the integrationist logics very well. So it's kind of my answer to this question. So member states, of course, very important, and the Court of Justice listen them very well, but case law represents a different situation, and that's my point in this research. Thank you.
There was a second question. Daria, who was it from?
Yes, there was a question from Alina Arnautova.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, and you mentioned two dimensions, internal and external dimension. And according to the internal dimension, you talked about the concept of multi-level governance. Could you clarify your point about multi-level governance system according to your research? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I need to...
on the slide,
it was not, I see it was not about the multi-level governance, but it was a complex multi-level systems of protection.
Yes, multi-level
yes,
system.
yes. And okay, I see. I'll try to develop this idea. This idea is actually closely connected with the mechanisms that exist now in the European Union in order to protect its individuals, in order to provide an effective systems of legal protection. So it's actually connected with some human rights issues and something like that. And the courts want to stress and to highlight that actually the system of the European Union today is highly complex and need to have a good legal protection that courts need to ensure. So when we speak about this legal system, acquis communautaire, that the court has, there's not always, we can find some effective mechanism to protect its individuals, and the courts take its role in order to fill these gaps and find a new and try to adapt system and to put these different gaps and to build an effective systems of legal protection within the multi-level system of European Union. That's this logic of the integration through law. So that's
Thank you.
my answer. Thank you.
We don't hear you, Timothy.
Yes, Tatiana, I'm sorry. Okay, Tatiana, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Sergey Shein. Sergey.
Yeah. Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Unfortunately, I don't have a presentation, but I think it is not an obstacle to tell shortly about impulse of right-wing populism for European Union foreign policy. So on the one hand, a significant number of studies are devoted to the analysis of the social base of populism, the reasons of its growth, and its impact on institutions and domestic politics. And on the other hand, influence on foreign policy remains under research for a long time. Nevertheless, the situation is changing. Over the past year or two, a significant amount of articles have been published on the populist actors' foreign policy programs and strategies. These studies are usually presented in the form of analysis of single case studies, for example, analysis of Donald Trump foreign policy, but such research is increasingly important to leverage in the European context as well, where populists strengthen their representation in national parliaments, in the European Parliament, and come to power in Central and Southern Europe. However, with the European Union facing the rise of populist, liberal, Eurosceptic tendencies in several member states, important questions arise about the impact of domestic political change on the European Union foreign policy. In implementing EU foreign policy, supranational level is largely marginalized, and the nature of this policy is more reactive than proactive. And based on this, it seems important to trace the impulse that right-wing populism can carry for the EU foreign policy, and then make a conclusion regarding the impact of right-wing populism for the European Union activeness in international relations. This presentation will outline general conclusions which can then be used to concretize and deepen through various case studies. First, we define what right-wing populism is. Then we formulate how the right-wing populist parties of Western and Eastern Europe affect EU foreign policy. And then we will correlate these effects with European Union activeness variables developed by Charlotte Breferton and John Vogler. So populism can be considered as an ideology, strategy, discourse, rhetoric, political style, or a combination of this. A common definition by Cas Mude poses populism as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the will of the people. Populism in its right variation uses nationalism, or in a narrow sense nativism, to defend the pure people. These characteristics are suitable for the National Rally in France, Alternative for Germany in Party of Independence Party in United Kingdom, League in Italy, Law and Justice in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary. It is well known that their foreign policy positions in general can be expressed by a number of basic characteristics. For example, restoring national sovereignty, replace European Union by Europe of nations, ignoring multilateral institutions, and limited participation in solving global problems. It seems more important not to delve into their party positions, but to take into account the essence of populism as a fragmented ideology. Populist political programs are characterized by a fair amount of eclecticism. They very much depend on the national context, and the key to their position is the isolation from the mainstream foreign policy positions. This logic, as well as experience of populist coalition governments in Italy and Austria and single-party governments in Hungary and Poland, suggest two main impulses of right-wing populism for EU foreign policy. First, for right-wing populists, foreign policy is a continuation of the party struggle at the national level. As a result, it leads to the politicization of issues which are related to EU foreign policy. So at the center of domestic political debate in EU members are not only issues of European integration, but issues of migration and security. National governments are forced to respond to the politicization of these issues and in some cases adapt populist foreign policy positions, which makes it difficult to find a compromise in the implementation of the EU foreign policy. And the second effect is about conflict of values, norms, and standards. The European Union largely bases its foreign policy on principles of promotion, international cooperation, development and consolidation of democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. And at the same time, the governments of such member states like Hungary and Poland question these norms and standards by restriction the judiciary, the media, and non-governmental organizations. Thus, the demand to change a political model of liberal democracy and desire to exclude certain social groups from the category of people come into tension with value priorities of the European Union and its normative component. And the final part, how to correlate these two impulses from right-wing populism to the EU foreign policy and the question of European Union actorness. Many scholars have analyzed and contributed to the concept of actorness of the European Union, and most of them use Shester's definition from 1977 as a starting point. Actorness in this case is a capacity to behave actively and deliberately in relation to other actors in the international system. However, there is no agreement among scholars on a shared concept for actorness and its indicators, and we will focus on the internal side of actorness, considering right-wing populism is an internal challenge. Let us try to understand how right-wing populism impulse to European Union foreign policy correlate with four variables which can increase or decrease European Union actorness. The first variable of European Union actorness is a shared commitment to a set of values. Values may be presented both as a characteristic of the Union's identity and as a key to achieving international actors' objectives, especially security and stability within Europe and its neighborhood. In this case, a problem with democratic procedures in Poland and Hungary conflicts with European Union values and destroys its shared commitment. The second variable of European Union actorness is domestic legitimation of decision-making process and priorities in relation to external policies. Right-wing populism, on the one hand, is actively used the problem of democratic deficit at the EU level and the existing crisis of legitimacy of the European integration project. On the other hand, it mobilized the voters, strengthening the significance of number of issues and has an ability to influence the political agenda regarding European Union foreign policy priorities. The third variable of European Union actorness is the ability to identify priorities and formulate policies captured by the concept of consistency and coherence. Consistency indicates the degree of congruence between the external policies of the member state and the European Union, and coherence reference to the level of internal coordination of European Union policies. Of course, right-wing populism does not deprive the European Union's opportunity to formulate a policy, but most likely it reduces the degree to which this can occur. Speaking about examples, Brexit as a product of activity of right-wing populism has led to problems with the formulation of a general European Union policy. For examples, when the foreign policy of European member state under the influence of right-wing populism diverges from the foreign policy of the European Union. For example, the Memorandum of Understanding between Italy and China, or Salvini approach to solving the migration problem. Various European Union's policies are sensitive to this to various degree, but the ability to formulate a common policy is crucial to the common foreign and security policy and development policy. And the last variable of European Union actorness is the availability of policy instruments. They can be political, economic, military. The influence of right-wing populism on access to these tools and the opportunities to use them are noticeably less pronounced. For example, the abolition of the European Union sanctions against Russia, which is manifested by West European and South European right-wing populists, did not even lead to attempts to revive them. Thus, correlating the effect of populism on European Union foreign policy and the variables of European Union actorness, we can say that populism affecting 3 of the 4 variables and can act as a factor that decrease the European Union activeness. Admitting that the right-wing populism impulse is noticeable, meanwhile, it is not necessary to exaggerate its influence. The limitation of this impulse are the ideological and pragmatic mostly that underlies the conceptual core of right-wing populism. The anti-systemic nature and national sovereignty is not the the only denominator of these political forces, and this is an obstacle to the development of a common agreed populist position on key issues of European Union development. Thank you. I will try to answer your questions.
Well, I have a question.
Yes, Alexei, and then Artyom. Yes, please.
Yes. Sergey, can you explain, please, the position of populists towards Russia? Because foreign policy and policy against the European Union is very interesting, but we remember the case of Donald Trump when some Russian politicians thought that Donald Trump will be the best variant for Russia. And what's about populists in the European Union if they increase their presence in European Union bodies, in national bodies? What do you think we can see towards Russia?
Yeah, I think that West European populists can demonstrate pro-Russian positions, but we need to take into account that it is not they're not really pro-Russian. They need to demonstrate this anti-systemic and anti-establishment nature. So I don't think that they can use some instruments to realize these pro-Russian positions in, for example, European Union's political agenda and so on. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, Alexei. Thank you. Artyom.
Thank you. Actually, honestly, I'm not sure that my question is connected with Sergey's topic. Nevertheless, I'll ask. So, actually, Sergey, why do you consider only the right populism and only its impulses? Actually, what about the left populism and actually its impulses for foreign policy, for European foreign policy? I don't know, maybe it's just your personal preferences to say only about the rights, but that's the question.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is a topic for future research, but I use only right-wing populism just because it's electoral success and maybe limited character of this presentation. So I can extend this term. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, and I apologize to all for my very bad moderation, since we are very much out of time. Now I invite Tatiana Romanova to join us with her insights. Tatiana, please.
Okay, I'm ready, and I'll try to put up my presentation as well. Is it on? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk very quickly about the levels, the problem of levels in analyzing EU-Russian relations. And well, like many of us, basically I try to understand, to conceptualize how EU-Russian relations moved from this position to that position. Yeah, so from the position of sort of like cooperation, coexistence to the conflictual relations. And I argue in the work that I'm doing now that levels are crucial to understand what, how, and where of EU-Russian relations. So what happened, how it happened, yeah, and where it happened. Yeah. In order to do that, many people who are here, in fact, like were present during my February presentation, so it's quite an evolution from that presentation. Basically, firstly, I suggest widening the understanding of the levels in international relations, because in international relations frequently levels are associated with the levels of analysis and with structural understanding of that. Yeah? And I suggest that we move to sort of a broader understanding, to the understanding that is based on Mario Bunge's work on levels, where, well, and in his work, he provides numerous definitions of levels. And in particular, there are two definitions that are of interest. That levels is a section of reality characterized by emergent qualities or by a set of interlocked properties and law, some of which are thought to be peculiar to the given domain. And what is also important in his work for this study, for the study that I'm doing, is that one and the same object may fit in various level structures, especially if the connotations of level changes in each case. So we can think about EU-Russian relations and EU-Russian relations and identify levels from different perspectives. And in the sort of like drawing on this, I suggest that we have three different perspectives on the levels. One is the structural one, the structural perspective, which is probably the best known in IR studies. And that's normally we speak about international order and the states. In the case of the European Union, we speak about EU and member states. In the case of EU-Russian relations, we can speak about Russia relating to EU, to member states. Then the EU having relations with the Eurasian Economic Union. And then, of course, there is a regional level. But then there are different, two other approaches to levels. One is the thematic level, where we can talk at the upper level on normative issues and values. We can then speak about more pragmatic policy level goals. For example, a free trade area would be a policy goal in EU-Russia relations, or a visa regime, a visa-free regime would be a policy goal. And then there are specific projects of detailed technical regulations that are meant to implement those policy goals. And then the third approach that I suggest, again, that's nothing new, but I just insist that we have to look at the level problem here. That's the sort of like division into intergovernmental, transgovernmental, and transnational levels. Transgovernmental being sort of like about low interaction among medium level officials and low level officials, and transnational, that's about economic ties or NGO ties, civil society ties, so that kind of the relations bypassing the state. And then, of course, these three sort of approaches to levels are interrelated. For example, we frequently talk about normative issues at the level of international order, which is also debated at the intergovernmental level. So we can talk about it during the Q&A. I don't want to elaborate too much on this because we have limited time. What is important is that I talk about levels in an epistemological rather than ontological way. It's just like for the purpose of analyzing EU-Russian relations. And then the famous metaphor about levels is the forest and trees metaphor, that you can look at the forest or you can look at the trees. This metaphor is valid for the levels, but we can also address the levels through the metaphor of the iceberg with the top and the foundation. So why to change the definition of the levels? Well, there is a methodological dimension. There is a methodological reason for that. Levels offer taxonomic convenience for any analysis. And these levels in particular tell us what to study in the thematic area, how to study and where to study in EU-Russian relations, and in this way to understand sort of the developments in EU-Russian relations. But more importantly, there is a theoretical dimension because it illustrates something that the three approaches share. Yeah, and the three approaches basically demonstrate us, that the EU and Russia have frequently chosen different levels for their dialogue. Yeah? And therefore, sometimes they spoke what I previously called different languages. Yeah? With the EU talking at the technical level and Russia talking at more sort of like conceptual level. So but there has always been, and frequently, maybe not always, but there has frequently been sort of like misfit between the levels that Russia and the European Union have, what Russia and the European Union chose, and that led to some problems. Secondly, the EU and Russia have tended to move to the upper level, or upper levels, in fact, discussing technical issues that frequently sort of like brought it to the normative level. And that, in fact, resulted in the politicization. And we can talk about thematic politicization, we can talk about institutional politicization, and we can talk about structural politicization. And then last but not least, the relations at present are maintained at lower level. Yeah, so there are relations at lower level. Yeah, we frequently speak about the fact that Russia and the European Union do not have any relations. But if you look at the structural levels, there is interaction at the regional level. Yeah, or at least there was before, sort of like borders were closed a few months ago. Then there is technical interaction. Yeah, so Russian still sort of like goes through the process of technical adjustment, mostly to EU standards. Yeah, and that's thematic interaction. And then there is interaction at the institutional level when we speak about transnational dialogues and transnational relations. Yeah, so the relations are at present maintained at low levels, and most contradictions are at the top level. Yeah, and that's sort of like this interaction at the lower level probably contains some seeds about how the relations can be improved. Yeah, but then of course it also shows where the problems are concentrated, and that sense there are limits to how much we can do at the technical level. And then, so having all this in mind, basically I applied to 3 different case studies. Yeah. So I look at the evolution of the concept of economic concept of EU-Russian relations, in particular of free trade area, yeah, and how that can be explored through different approaches to levels. I look at the energy dialogue, and I see sort of how energy dialogue can be explored through different approaches to levels. And then I also look at the visa-free dialogue in EU-Russian relations and demonstrate how that can be studied and the results sort of like of this study through the levels of analysis perspective. Yeah. So that's just a very brief summary of the research, but I think I mostly have mostly used the time that was allocated. Yeah. So I hope that gives the feeling of what I'm doing, and I will be happy to answer any question that results from this presentation.
Tatiana, thank you very much. I think that you explored the very interesting approaches to the studying of the relationships between the European Union and Russia. In my personal view, it all deserves the question as a new way, as a ways to look better at the particularities of the relationships. Well, I personally believe that the major problem is not that relationships between Russia and European Union went one way or another way, that they went wrong. The problem was that this partnership did not happen from the very beginning. So because of the basic prerequisites which did not exist for this partnership yes, for more than diplomatic or limited trade relationships between Russia and Europe to happen. But this problem needs to be traced back to the very early stages and to the basic institutional prerequisites of both partners and limitations. Yes.
Well, I guess the question is why it didn't happen, yeah, and what prerequisites like were missing, yeah. And then again, like if you want, if you draw a parallel between what was going on between Russia and the European Union and what was going on in the 1950s, yeah, for example, within the European Union, you will see that something that is clearly different is that they had a clear policy goal, yeah. So something that I call meso level. Yeah? So they had a very tangible meso level goal, yeah? Which we have never had, yeah? Because we either talked about the relations at the conceptual level or at the technical level. Yeah? Missing sort of like something that normally stabilizes the relations. Yeah? So that's just like to address one of your points. Yes, indeed, the partnership didn't happen. But I guess the key question is why it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what the study tries to research by suggesting this perspective.
So I would think that why don't you also incorporate into your methodological framework more general issues associated with the major mainstream theories of international relations, and also have a short brief look at the possible prerequisites and limitations which can be explained by these theories. Well, just as I'm not so professional in European studies as you are, but I mean, in my view, the answer is might be relatively simple. European Union and integration is based on a certain balance of power between the participating states. And this balance of power has happened within the certain institutional arrangements, and the stable partnership with Russia and continuing partnership could have happened only under the condition of incorporation of Russia within this internal European balance of power. And this was not possible because of the other reasons, which we can discuss for a long time. But I think as I can offer this simple explanation from the perspective of one of the mainstream theories, I believe that other mainstream theories can also give some insight.
Yes, and it will be a different study. And it will be different.
Okay. Okay. Artem has a question, please.
And Yulia Belous next.
And Yulia Belous next.
Thank you, Tian, for your report. My question is quite hypothetical. It's a kind of what if question. My question is, and what if not every problem, not every issue, every case assumes the possibility for all three dimensions and for all three levels? I'll try to ask what if levels and dimensions are not universal? Maybe problems, issue, cases, it doesn't matter how to say, constitutes possible levels and possible dimensions, and the situations, for example, what you described when the EU and Russia have chosen frequently different levels for cooperation within the framework of one case is a normal situation. So that's the question. Is clear?
Well, whether it's universal or not, I mean, that's about the sort of like borders, yeah, of any theoretical concept that still remains to be explored. But for now, I think that at least in EU-Russia relations, it works in most cases. Yeah? But I will be happy to sort of like learn where it doesn't work, because that's always interesting. And then, of course, the question of why it doesn't work will be also important for me. So if you have any particular example, I will be more than happy to hear that. Yeah. And then, well, the question of normal, sort of like normality, is a tricky question, isn't it? Yeah, because first normal for who, and then what is the norm? Yeah, that's the second one. Yeah. yes, there are some predispositions for Russia and the European Union to talk at different levels. Yeah? There is a predisposition for the European Union to talk at the technical level, for example, yeah? And there is a predisposition for at least Russian foreign policy to talk at the conceptual level. Yeah, but and you are right in that sense, yeah, because because Russia and the European Union are different actors. But what is interesting in this particular case is what is the result of this different predispositions for Russia and for the European Union. Did I answer your question?
Yes, yes, thank you. It's an interesting idea about levels, so thank you.
Yulia, yeah, I think.
Yes. Tatiana, thank you for a brilliant presentation. Actually, I've studied some works of you on these topics, and all the time I think one question. Do you think that this methodological frame that you suggest also describes and explains well not only European Union-Russian relations, but also other European Union and different countries, relations with different countries? Or it's only applicable for the case EU-Russia?
I mean, in principle, it can also be applied to other relations of Russia, yeah, to the US-Russian relations or China-Russian relations, or to other relations of the European Union. Yeah. So I don't think it's constrained by EU-Russian relations. But see, your question is somehow relates to the question of Artyom.
Yes, I see.
Limitations, whereas you speak about the universality. Yeah? And that, I mean, the short answer is that I don't know how universal it is, and I don't know what are the limits at present, yeah, because at least as it stands now, I think it's a methodological instrument that can be applied to virtually any relations, yeah? But maybe there are some limits, yeah, and that's still to be explored.
Thank you. Maybe we will study it more.
Okay, Fabienne, please, we invite you. Last but not least.
Yeah, okay, indeed, last but not least. Well, so now we're going to go back to the issue of resilience. But first, a disclaimer. So what I will be presenting is still very much work in progress. So I will present a draft version of the literature review section of a paper that I'm working on. Now, what is so particular about the paper is that it draws on post-development thinking and post-colonial thinking, with the aim of further advancing the emergent scholarship that critically reviews EU foreign policy. So I guess I'm in the fortunate position in this panel to be the only European, and it's very interesting, of course, to discuss EU foreign policy being the only European, but actually I'm also myself quite, as an academic, quite critical when it comes to EU foreign policy. And so therefore I would align myself increasingly with scholars that have been critically reviewing EU foreign policy. Some of you might know that in recent years, a growing number of scholars has been proposing a so-called decentered agenda for the study and practice of the EU's actorness in international relations. And this all goes back to the issue that we have been discussing in this panel as well, like how universal is so-called model that the EU is promoting. I guess these scholars would say, well, actually, it's not very universal. It's all in all quite Eurocentric. And so these scholars argue that we need to move away from the predominant Eurocentric views, not only of the EU, but also in the literature itself. So oftentimes we also see in literature the centrality of European perspectives. And so what these scholars argue is that we should adopt a decentralized standpoint. And so which scholars am I talking about? So this is, for instance, an article published by Fischer, Onar, and Nikolaidis in 2013, but also an article by Keukelere and Kok in 2018, among others. So my paper seeks to contribute to these scholarly debates by critically engaging with the EU's approach to resilience. So I don't have to, I guess, mention it, because by now we all know, based on two of the other papers in this panel, that resilience has become a guiding principle of the EU's external action. ever since the global strategy was introduced in 2016. But it's also an overarching paradigm now for the EU's governance promotion. Now, a multitude of academic studies have shown the limited effectiveness of the EU's promotion of governance in the EU's neighborhood and further afield. Again, also in the papers by Daria and Artin, by Daria and others, we have seen that there are serious limitations to the resilience building agenda of the EU, and there are limitations to what can be achieved. So when it comes to explaining the limited effectiveness of the EU's promotion of governance and resilience building, I would say that most scholars take a rather narrow approach, and they would point to, well, as we have also seen in this panel, well, both internal factors, so factors relating to the EU itself, but also external factors. They would point to, for instance, the limited incentives that the EU can use, or the deficient mechanisms and instruments that the EU uses. Some scholars have taken a broader perspective, and they have argued that it is the EU's neoliberal approach to governance that hinders the effectiveness of the EU's governance promotion. Now, if we look specifically at the case of resilience building, my paper joins those scholars who argue in favor of a radical departure from this neoliberal approach that the EU follows in the conceptualization and promotion of resilience in third countries. So my paper basically aligns itself with scholars who argue that if the EU is really serious about promoting resilience as a way to empower the local communities and as a way to contribute towards a truly sustainable future for the societies of these countries, then the EU actually needs to embrace a decentered, post-neoliberal approach to resilience instead of this typical Eurocentric neoliberal approach that it is now using. It was also already mentioned in this panel that because of the current crisis, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is now a growing contestation of the notion of resilience, with David Chandler, for instance, arguing that what we now see is the end of resilience as we know it. Now, I don't really agree with him, and I'm not the only one who would actually argue that the crisis has only further revealed the relevance of resilience in today's highly unpredictable and highly challenging, complex world. Now, this assertion can only apply if it's based on the understanding that resilience building is about boosting the ability of people, or the ability of a society, if you like, to self-organize, whereby they can draw on their local strengths and the local knowledge, also local knowledge of their available resources, and also drawing on how they envision a better future for themselves. So this is also very much in line, for instance, with what Jelena Koresteleva has been arguing. Now, what this implies is that the EU would have to accept the other, namely those local societies, for what they are, and the EU needs to advocate homegrown self-organization or homegrown self-governance based on a deep understanding of what good life means or what a good society is. And this is then where I want to bring in the post-development element and also the post-colonial insights. Now, there is already an emerging body of literature, for instance, the work by Jelena Koresteleva, who have been proclaiming this need for the EU to start advocating homegrown self-governance. But I've noticed that this is still coming from a heavily IR-focused perspective. And I would say that because of that, they're already also themselves being quite Western-oriented, Western-dominated by the frameworks that they're using. And what I want to do is I want to advance this literature by bringing in insights from post-development and post-colonial thinking as a way to offer an ontologically more favorable approach to conceptualizing and operationalizing a truly decentered post-neoliberal paradigm of resilience building as governance promotion. So my central point is that if we truly want to introduce and conceptualize a decentered approach to resilience building, then we also need to decenter a Western-centric or EU-centric conceptualizations of society and good life. And instead, we really need to start from the local understandings and local conceptualizations of what a good society is or what a good life means. And to this end, my paper then draws on insights from post-development and post-colonial thinking. So in particular, I want to explore conceptualizations of good life and good society. And I want to extrapolate this to the practice of EU foreign policy. And as such, I want to lay the foundation for a new paradigm of governance promotion that starts from the local meanings of good life and good society. The so-called post-neoliberal paradigm accepts that there is no single meaning of good life. There is no single meaning of good society. So the meanings of this vary from one country to another, or from one society to another, from one community sometimes to another. So there are many formulations of what a good life and a good society are. And these formulations are all particular, and they all reflect the specific value commitments of societies. So this new paradigm involves accounting for local systems and local mechanisms of governance that, of course, can be radically different from European practices of governance. Now, given that EU knowledge about the other, so about these local societies, is still Eurocentric and elitist, it reproduces patterns of political, cultural, and social domination. So this also means that if we want to enable the emergence of local conceptualizations of good life or good society, there is a need to also decolonize EU knowledge production on governance. Now I'm also just basically criticizing myself, because this is what I've done myself so far. So I think I also am speaking towards myself. You know, this is what I have to do. I have to decolonize my knowledge production. And so I firmly believe that European scholars can only achieve this by teaming up with scholars from the regions that they are studying. And so in my case, for instance, this is mainly Central Asia. And so what I want to do, or what I've already started doing, is to then offer an empirical illustration of how this post-neoliberal paradigm of governance promotion could be operationalized by drawing from a concrete case, namely the mahallas in Uzbekistan. So the mahallas are community-based institutions of self-governance, which are deeply rooted in Uzbek society. So although first initially I wanted to study this myself, suddenly I came to realize, well, what am I doing? I'm just contradicting what I initially, or what I eventually want to do, because I have my Western Eurocentric mindset. And with that, how can I possibly understand the mahallas? I only look at it through this Western lens. So that's why I reached out to a local scholar, so Nozima Davletova, and so she will then provide the input on the mahallas, and together basically then we can offer this empirical illustration. I think I will leave it at this, because time is definitely running out, but thank you very much for your attention, and of course if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabienne. Without any doubt, this is an excellent and promising beginning based on the absolutely solid background. So we anticipate your further work on this particular angle. As I see, one of our colleagues, Artem Alikin, has a question. But Artem, can I please ask you to be as short as possible? I apologize to all, because my next Zoom seminar starts in 15 minutes. I feel very, very sorry. Artem, please. Artem.
Sorry. I forget to switch my microphone. Thank you, Fabian, for your report. My question is that, as far as I understand, you associate the centering of European foreign policy with the acceptance of the other. And my question is, can we describe maybe perceive this acceptance of the other as a kind of substitution from the side of the EU to avoid the responsibility for European measures, European moves to promote governance abroad and so on. So that my question, is the acceptance of the other a kind of substitution for EU responsibility, avoidance of the responsibility for some European foreign moves?
That's a challenging provocation. Can be considered as a challenging provocation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Yeah. No. Of course, I'm aware of there are some serious implications, of course, to the arguments that underpin my main claim, which means that, you know, in building this truly decentered approach or post-neoliberal approach, yeah, the EU really needs to accept the other as the way they are. Personally, I don't think this should be seen as a substitute for taking responsibility, but there are debates that go further, and actually, I mean, this is also crucial in post-development thinking. I personally am not that radical yet, but there are scholars who would say, like, the EU actually has to disengage entirely from other countries. You know, it's, you know, just the way that the whole model that the EU is advocating has clearly shown that it doesn't work, this whole neoliberal model. So there are scholars who would say, like, you know, the EU should just stop intervening in these countries, and yeah, then you could say, well, then really the EU could just stop taking responsibility. But from my point of view, I think it's rather I would say it's very unlikely that the EU would do that. That would be a truly radical departure from the current approach to EU foreign policy. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But at least I think there is a growing scholarship that is very critical of EU foreign policy because it's so Eurocentric. You know, the EU is so EU-centric, and the EU needs to realize that it cannot keep on claiming to be acting as a universal international actor, proclaiming universal principles, because it's not. Supposedly, the whole resilience building part of the global strategy was aimed specifically at that. But I guess most of the scholars would agree that it has failed to do that.
Thank you very much, Fabienne. I must apologize because of the personal reasons. I need to leave the room.
No
and I give a floor. Yes, I give a floor for the comment to Tatiana Romanova, and then she will sum up and close our session. Fabienne, thank you. Thanks to everybody. We'll see you next time. I will ask Yulia Belous to make a sort of the short analytical brief of this discussion, and then send it to everyone. Just we can use it for.
Okay.
I'm again for the need to.
Okay.
Fabienne, I have two questions which are related. One is, okay, we can talk about post-liberal, post-colonial, post-post, but does it really eliminate the EU's position of a mentor, yeah, in any relations, yeah, and in particular in promotion of resilience, yeah? And then secondly, more from a researcher perspective, to what extent you being a European researcher can help to decenter the notion of resilience? To which extent can it be your business? Yeah, and isn't it not colonialism or post-colonialism in itself as well?
Yeah.
Nothing personal, but just like wondering.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah. Yeah, these are also two excellent questions. The answer to the first question is no. I think even if the EU would start adopting this more so-called post-neoliberal approach to resilience building, it would still be in the position of the mentor. it will never be there will never be a truly equal relationship between the EU and the third countries in which it is involved. So I think that's just, yeah, it's inevitable. I mean, it's not possible. So that as long as the EU, I think, has an international agenda and seeks to help others, there will always be this mentor relationship. So there, I think, yeah, the only way would be indeed, yeah, to withdraw from other countries. That would be the only way, I think, which, as I say, is extremely radical, although there are scholars who argue in the favor of this. Then for your other question, this is one that I struggle with myself very much. Yeah, and I've had the exact same comments with my own colleagues who are even more radical than me when it comes to this post-development agenda. I apologize, by the way, there are constructions work going on next door, so there might be some noise. But yeah, I mean, that's one I really struggle with myself. And I sort of feel this tension inside of me that I know, like, actually it shouldn't be me, you know, advocating this post-neoliberal agenda. You know, it should be people from these local societies. And so this is, well, I thought that I can overcome this by teaming up, but still, of course, it's me imposing my agenda and my ideas. So I think ultimately, if we really want to decolonize the European knowledge creation or knowledge production, yeah, that there will have to be reverse trend, whereby it's us following others and not the others following us. So even if we team up, I can still see some of these challenges remaining. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions left? Daria, do you have any?
I do not see any other hands raised, so I believe it's all for now.
Yeah. Well, with that, then I think we've had a very productive session. We went all like much beyond the time limit, the original time limit, and then the second time limit. But I hope it was useful for everybody. So thank you very much to those who presented. Thank you very much to those who joined us, who asked questions. And I hope that sort of like has been a nice support for all of us struggling in sort of like in a lockdown. So at least like some academic life continues, and I hope that it will continue even more. And hopefully next year we will meet in a normal format of the April conference. And I wish as well all the success with all your studies that you are currently carrying out. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to Daria who arranged that, and to the High School of Economics that provided the framework for it.
Yeah, on my behalf, I thank you very much for your presence, for sharing with your ideas with all us. And if you want to continue your research experience with us, I shall say that tomorrow we have a session on the evolution of the American and US foreign policy, so you can join us. If you're interested, you can leave your email in the chat section and I will send you the invitation to the event.